Our interview this morning is with Raymond Karl Neal. Mr. Neal was born in Scott County, Kentucky, October of 1923. He served in the United States Army Air Corps, later the United States Air Force, from February of 1943 until December of 1946. My name is Dale Dexheimer. I'm not related to Mr. Neal in any way. Also in the room we have Milton Gibson, who is our videographer. Today is Friday, July the 26th,
Yes.
Year 2013. This interview is conducted at this interview is conducted at Burleson, Texas. Interview is conducted for the Veterans History Project in Washington and also for Operation Remember here in Burleson. And with that little introduction, Mr. Neal, you can tell us about your time in the U.S. military, sir.
Very good. As we have discussed before, I was born in the hill country in Kentucky. My relatives were all tobacco farmers there. When I was about 3 years old, my father decided that trying to raise tobacco was a terrible way to try to support a family and make a living. So we packed up everything and moved to central Indiana, where he went to work for Delco-Remy Division of General Motors in Anderson, Indiana. I think he did a good thing by moving us there because we had a steady income and we grew up under good conditions in Indiana. I was in high school from the time I was about 13, and during the time that I was in high school, I worked at a grocery store every afternoon and evening and weekends. But I managed to get enough time to go to the YMCA and play some basketball and be involved in some athletics. And as a result of that environment, I went through the technical section of Anderson High School, and I came out in 1942 as top student in the technical section. I was in the upper 10% of my graduating class in high school, and was invited to join the National Honor Society, which I did, until I went to the first meeting and I found out it was all girls and me, so that was enough of that. But anyway, when I graduated from high school, I had a job waiting at Delco-Remy Division of General Motors. I could have gone to work out in the production area there for about $2.69 an hour, or they also offered a salaried apprenticeship for like $115 a month, which was a lot less money, but I took the salaried apprenticeship because it had an opportunity for me to sign up to go to General Motors Tech up at Flint, Michigan. And I went to work at Delco-Remy and took the test, and I think there were 3 out of 16 of us that got accepted to go to GM Tech. In the meantime, the war had started. It was getting pretty hot, and I had always wanted to fly ever since I was a little kid. I designed and built my own model airplanes and was always interested in flying. So on Thanksgiving Day of 1942, 5 of us got in one of my buddy's cars and went up to Bear Field at Fort Wayne, Indiana, and enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and went back to work. And I was supposed to start my first quarter at GM Tech in March of '43, but in February of '43 I got my call to active duty from Uncle Sam, so I missed my opportunity to go to GM Tech. So I I got on the troop train in Indianapolis, Indiana. We took like 2 days and 3 nights to get from there down to Keesler Field at Biloxi, Mississippi. And when we got off of the train, they lined us up along beside the train, and the first thing, it was black of night, it was dark, and the first thing that I heard when I heard anything at all was a voice saying, "You guys is not privates, you guys is not cadets, you is privates." So that's kind of how my military career started. But we spent 9 weeks down at Keesler Field in Biloxi, living in tents, and for a while we had some quarters of a wooden frame building with fold-out windows. And anyway, we learned to put up with the climate and learn to march and learn to salute and do all of the basic Army stuff. And at the end of that time, I was shipped to Bristol, Tennessee, to what was called then a college training detachment. We went into college there, and we were the first troops to be in Bristol, Tennessee. And it was called King's College. It was a little Christian college, I think. And so we got set up in King's College, and I don't remember how many of us there were there, but anyway, there were 2 girls' schools, girls' colleges in Bristol, Tennessee. One was Sullins, and the other was Virginia Intermont. And we were the first eligible guys they had seen for a long time. So we had a dance at Sullins, and then we had a dance at Virginia Intermont, and life wasn't too bad, except you didn't have too much spare time, you know. And what spare time you had was well controlled. But I got through the college training detachment and was sent to Nashville, Tennessee, to a classification center. From Nashville, I went to primary training in Camden, South Carolina, and there we flew PT-17s, and that was the airplane that I soloed in. That was when I did my first solo flight in an airplane, was at Camden, South Carolina. And we spent about 2 months there. And while I was there, I came down with the flu, and I was laid up in bed for a while, so I stepped back 1 class in our system. I started out in 44D, and I wound up in 44E because of that case. But then from Camden, South Carolina, I went to Bristol, Tennessee, I went to Augusta, Georgia, where we flew BT-13s and BT-15s. And I was fortunate enough to have one of my buddies whose home was in Augusta, Georgia. And I got to go to his home one day for dinner, and his mother was one of the Goodrich family, the tire people. And they were quite wealthy, and they still had, quote, servants, which was kind of a new experience for me. But anyway, it was great being there, and I did get to play golf on the golf course there at Augusta, which is now the well-renowned golf course. And anyway, we finished up our basic flight training, and I went to Marietta, Georgia for advanced flying training in the AT-6. And one of the events that happened there was that we were doing close formation training, in which case the instructor and one student would go in the lead airplane, and then there would be 2 wing airplanes flying, and the instructor would coach from his spot, and we'd fly for about 30 minutes that way, and then we'd landed at a satellite field of Eglin down in Florida, and it was just a bare strip out in the country. And when we landed there, I was with the instructor in starting this thing. When we landed there, I got out and just changed airplanes with one of the other guys, didn't even shut the engines down. And we took off and on the next leg of our training flight and got about 1,500 feet above the field, and all of a sudden I got nothing but flames coming out of my cow flaps all around, just flames. So I didn't want to have to bail out of the airplane. Two reasons: the airplane is lost, and third reason is getting out of an airplane back in those days safely was also a problem. So I was just kind of above the strip that we had taken off from, so I just slipped it sideways down onto the strip and landed it on the strip. And by the time it had slowed to about 30 miles an hour, I was out on the wing and off of it because I was afraid it would blow up. And they did have a fire truck there, so they were able to get to the airplane and put the fire out. But then I was really concerned that I would maybe get washed out of flying because they had too many guys in the system at that time. And we heard stories in the ready room about check rides where an officer would come in and say, "You," and the guy would get in the airplane, they would go for a ride, come back, and you're washed out. And the guy tells me he never touched the controls on the airplane. So they were trying to reduce the number of people, and I was really concerned that because of that fire, I might just wind up as being on the washout list. But anyway, they evaluated it and found that the guy that had flown the airplane, the flight before me, had flown the whole 30 minutes or so with the oil cooler shutters closed. And it burned off nearly all of the insulation on the wiring up around the engine. And when I got in it and put the power to it a little bit, got a spark that set it on fire. So I was able to graduate in Marianna, Florida, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. That was in May of 1944. From there, I think I had about a week at home, and then I had to report back to. Well, there was another thing that I would mention while I was still in training there in Marianna, Florida. We were there for a short time after graduation, and I got to fly the old P-40 Warhawk for a few hours to learn a little bit about what a really powered airplane would feel like. And then we went to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C., which was Andrews Field at that time. And there we started our training in P-47s, learning to fly the P-47s. Of course, being a one-seater, you were on your own right from the get-go. You didn't have anybody with you in the airplane. There was no jump seats or any way to get two people in that airplane. So the big old P-47 was a little difficult at first because when you were sitting in it, the nose of the airplane blocked out your whole view. So when you were going out the taxi strips, you had to do S-curves in order to see out each side to make sure you were going to be okay. But anyway, I went through training there, even some night flying, and I then went to Millville, New Jersey, which was P-47 gunnery school, and we did some aerial gunnery and some ground gunnery, shooting at targets on the ground and shooting at towed targets in the air. And once we got through with our training at Millville, New Jersey, we were ready to ship overseas. So I went to Camp Chilmer, New York as a port of embarkation, and we got on a converted oil tanker. It was about a 600-foot ship, no, 160-foot ship. and I don't remember how many of us were on it, but it was kind of a tough trip. You ate breakfast standing up at a little chest-high table, and you had Navy coffee, which was tough stuff. And it was kind of a bad trip because the Germans were busy out in the Atlantic at that time with aerial attacks on convoys going across. we also had submarines out there, and we had a submarine attack on our convoy, and the destroyers were right up alongside our ship, sending out those depth charges to try to get the submarines. But anyway, we got through all of that, and it calmed down, and we arrived in Southampton, England. And when we got off of the boat, there was like a USO stand there with serving coffee and donuts and stuff, you know. And so I went up to get a good cup of coffee, and they'd put cream in it, but I didn't usually put cream in my coffee, but I took it and I said, "Thank you very much," and I sipped it, and it was tea. So we're already in new experiences in England. But I went to sort of a replacement depot in England. The nearest town was a little town called Stone, and it was in the coal mining area of England. And we were there at Christmas time. And I remember one of my buddies had very protectively carried a bottle of scotch in his duffel bag with him just for a Christmas celebration. And when he went to get the scotch out of his duffel bag, the whole bottom of the bottle was gone, and the scotch, the bottle was empty. But anyway, we managed to get through Christmas, and we were only there maybe 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. And we got on a boat, and they flew us from there over to the continent, a place near Paris, and dumped us off. It was cold. Snow was about knee high or a little better, and we were living in tents on one of Rothschild's estates, where there was a great big beautiful building there, but we were out in the tents in the snow. And from there we got on a 4x4 truck in the back and headed for Belgium. And we went to Belgium, and that's where I joined my fighter outfit. I was assigned to the 9th Air Force 366 Fighter Group, 389th Fighter Squadron, and we got there we were traveling during late New Year's Day, and we got there late New Year's night, and there had just been a big German attack on the airfield there during July the 1st. That was one of the major efforts of the Germans to drive the 9th Air Force off of the continent. Didn't work too well, but they did some pretty serious damage to most of the air bases that we had on the continent at that time. But anyway, I got to combat, and I flew 32 combat missions before Hitler decided it was time to fold things up. And I did manage. We were flying really, really heavy during April, and I got a little R&R time, and so I got to go down to the French Riviera for a week. And they flew us down there and let us out, and we were just supposed to be there a week, and we were there actually when President Roosevelt died. I think that was April the 12th, 1945. And anyway, something happened, and the airplane that was supposed to come get us at the end of the week couldn't get back down there. And we had a few more days to spend, but we didn't have any money. So we were out scrounging around for a place to stay and food to eat and that sort of thing for another week or so before they managed to come down and get us. But anyway, that was all pretty nice, and I enjoyed the Riviera. And anyway, we went back to combat, and then the war ended on May the 7th, 1945. And there was one thing that I didn't mention earlier. In the time that I was with the fighter outfit, we were in Belgium when we started, and shortly thereafter we moved into German soil to near Munster, Germany, and we were the first combat outfit to fly combat missions off of German soil, which is kind of a thing for the 366. But anyway, after the war, I remained in Germany in the occupation force, and along about in September, and during that time I became operations officer for our squadron, which means that I scheduled all of the flights and assigned the guys to flight and go where. But most of the flying that we were doing then was weather reconnaissance and some training and that sort of thing. And I had a weather reconnaissance mission out one day, and we were going down into southern Germany, and I just started up over the Bavarian Alps, and my engine quit on me. And first thing I did, of course, was reach down and switch gas tanks, because you have 3 gas tanks on the P-47. If you run one of them dry, your engine quits. So I reached down and switched gas tanks, no engine. So I said, heck, I must have gotten a vapor lock or something. So I got on the primer, and I hit the primer about a half a dozen times, and still nothing. By this time, I'm putting the nose down and looking around, and I couldn't get the engine to even cough, one burst of anything. So I saw a little landing strip that was being used by the artillery spotter guys. L4s and L5s were flying off of it. And I said, hey, I think I can put this old jug down on that little strip. So I headed down toward the strip, and by the time I got lined up, about ready to go in, I could then see that right out in the middle of it was a bulldozer and a work crew. So I had to abort the strip and peel off and put my old airplane down in a sod field. That all went pretty smoothly, and I survived that. While I was doing that, one of the guys that was flying an L4 off of that little strip came over and landed nearby. And by the time first thing I did when I hit the ground and stopped, I got out of the airplane and got about 100 yards away just in case of fire or explosion or that sort of thing. But when I was convinced it wasn't going to blow up, I went back and got on the radio and told my guys where they were and how to get back home, and asked them to get somebody to come get me. But anyway, this guy in the L4 landed right beside where I'd bellied in, and he took me up to, this was near Hanau, Germany, which was near Frankfurt, and he flew me up to Frankfurt, which was a functional base for the Air Force. So I went up there, and there were airplanes flying in and out of there, and I caught one C-47, which was being flown by the Air Transport Command, and they were going right to my home field from there. But you think they'd let me ride? I didn't have any orders, so they wouldn't let me on that airplane. But anyway, there was a nurse there that took pity on me and bought me my supper, because when you were out flying over there, you had no money, no ID, nothing but your flying suit. And so she bought me dinner that evening in the officers club, and I'm in there with everybody dressed up, and I'm in my old flight suit. But anyway, I found out where the quartermaster was, and I went down to the quartermaster, and they gave me a blanket and pointed to an empty barracks that had some cots, so that's where I spent the night. The next day, I went back up to operations again, and after a while being there, one of my old buddies from my outfit came flying down in a little L5, and I said, hey, Kelly, you came to get me. He said, what are you doing here? So he hadn't come to get me. He'd come to pick up another light airplane, and he had a guy with him. But anyway, once they got it checked out, I took the other airplane and flew it back to our home base. So that's how I got back to Fritzlar. But anyway, I was in the occupation there until sometime in December, I guess it was, and I got orders to go home. And we were going to deport from Le Havre, France, and we had to ride a boxcar all the way from Germany over to Le Havre, France to get our trip home started. And I forgot how long that took, but it was 2 or 3 days in a boxcar. And somewhere along the way, somebody met us with some sea rations to feed us a little bit. But anyway, we left France, and this is getting close to mid-December. We got on a big ship. It was USS George Washington. It had been captured in World War I and had been in mothballs for years. And in World War II, they had brought it out and made it serviceable, using it for a troop ship. So I understand that there were something like 7,000 of us on this big ship to come home. And we started out across the North Atlantic, and this is mid-December, but somewhere about the middle of the Atlantic out there, we ran into one of the worst hurricanes that they'd ever had. We had sub-zero temperatures, and we had 115 knot winds. We had waves that were 80 foot tall. You could look out on the top deck of this ship and look up at the waves. And so it was kind of a rough ride home. And after going through we went through a really bad time. They were afraid that the heavy seas were going to break the steering tackle on the ship. And if you lost steering out there, man, you were done, you know. So they took a crew out on the fantail of the ship to drop extra tackle down to hook onto the rudder tackle to help relieve it, you know. But to hook it on down there, they had to cut the engines for just a brief period of time. And when they cut the engines, man, a wave came along and just whammed us right up really steep. And I was laying on my bunk down below at that time. I had a big I-beam right above me, and I could see everything in there lift and just go zoop to the left, you know. And I grabbed that I-beam and hung on so that I didn't get tossed out. But anyway, the next day we found out from some of the ship's crew that we came within 1 degree of the capsizing angle when that happened. And it was cold and icy, and we went in, made it on into New York, and the next day the New York Times had a picture of our old ship, all ice encrusted and everything, that was on the front page of the New York Times. But anyway, I got back to the States. The Air Force, or the Air Corps, was looking for people to stay in. They felt like they needed officer personnel pretty badly. So I signed up for another year, hoping that I would get an assignment somewhere where I could get into single-engine airplanes and do some work there. But they let me look around, but there just wasn't any of those kind of jobs available anywhere. And I wound up being assigned to Castle Field, Merced, California. And there were, I think, something like 70 of us guys that, not from my ship, but all told, that wound up being at Castle Field at that time. And hadn't been there very long until the base commander decided that all of you pilots got to have real jobs. So I got to be police and prison officer for the base. And that was kind of an interesting venture because I had never been involved with military in the Air Force. And in this police and prison officer job, the guardhouse belonged to me. All of the military police were mine. The base arms and ammunition was all mine. The skeet range was all mine, which was kind of a plus. But anyway, Merced, California at that time was kind of a small town, 15,000 population, something like that, but they had 72 active bar licenses working. And I wound up spending a lot of time going down to Merced and riding around with the city police during the night because I had my military guys down there, my MPs down there working. So I passed a lot of time that way. Also got to visit a little bit of California, like Merced and Carmel and places like that while I was out there, and found that it was really a nice place to live if you were a civilian. But anyway, when my time was up, I decided that I wasn't going to stay in any longer because I didn't really enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps to be a police and prison officer or an acting provost marshal, which I was for a while. So I got out at the end of 1946, went back to, I got discharged at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, went back home to Indiana, and went back to work for Delco Remy Division of General Motors, because the things that they did back in those days, they made sure if you were an employee and went into the service, that when you came back, you had a job. So I went back to work for Delco Remy, and in June of 1947, I married my wife Joan, and we bought a house in Anderson and took up housekeeping. And I worked as a tool designer there at Delco Remy until 1951, and I found out at that time that Transport Aircraft in Dallas was looking for people that had my skills and talent. And so I left Delco Remy and we moved to Dallas, and I went to work for Transport Aircraft doing tool design work. And during the time that I was with Transport, I moved from tool design into manufacturing research and development, and I did a lot of neat things while I was doing that. We were doing some high energy forming, which was new stuff, new technology. And when the Saturn program came along, our company had the contract to build the tankage for the rocket. And the tanks had two sizes. There was like a 6-foot diameter and a 10-foot diameter tank. Excuse me. And they were made up with pressure bulkheads and an external bulkhead. And our company, in developing these parts, had to employ a new process of shear forming to form these spherical bulkheads. And they got so tied up in that they were run out of time to get the elliptical domes formed. And I was working manufacturing R&D and doing high energy forming, so they came and asked me if I could maybe do those. And we checked them out, and they were formable. You know, the metal could be formed okay, but we didn't have any facility for doing that sort of thing. So we were located right at the edge of Mountain Creek Lake over Grand Prairie, and I said, yeah, we'll do it. And so I got my maintenance crew to go down there and dig me a hole just not far from the lake, about 12, 15 feet deep, and we piled the dirt up all around and went over to Cadillac Plastics and bought some big, big sheets of plastic and covered the bottom of that with that plastic. And then I had our fire truck come down, and they put a suction line in the lake and filled my little pond up with water. And while that was being done, I was building a die to create the form for this elliptical dome. And so when we got the die built, got the little pond, I got our maintenance outfit to come down and lift our die into the water. You put a suction line on the bottom of the die so you draw a vacuum underneath the part. And then we took a piece of wire framing and put the explosive charge above it. And it took 2 charges to form the part completely, but we did it. And that I got to participate in some of the space work, because that was one of the programs that went into space. So we formed quite a number of those bulkheads down there in that little makeshift place. But shortly after we got started and we made some of the first parts, we went down there and built a metal tank and poured a concrete slab with some steel rails and built a gantry where we could go over the tank and out. So we formed quite a bit of the Saturn program tankage domes down there that way. And that's just one of those little things that's not ever known by anybody except the guys that were involved in doing it, you know. But anyway, I went on and spent quite a bit of time with Vought. I got appointed as our CAD-CAM specialist for the company when computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing came along. And as being our representative, I got to work with nearly every other aerospace and computer company in the US of A and some in Europe. So I got a pretty good exposure to the whole industry. And I was appointed as a member of the Aerospace Industries Association Committee for CAD/CAM, later became the chairman of that committee. I was also appointed to a committee for an organization that was headquartered in Arlington called Computer-Aided Manufacturing International. And they had an advanced technical planning committee, and I wound up being head of that committee for a while. And so I traveled around quite a bit during those years in this country. I even made a couple of trips to England. And by the end of, or by, in 1963, I skipped a little bit there. In 1963, our company set up a new division in Michigan. We had a contract with the Army to build a Lance missile for the Army, but the contract said the work had to be done in the Detroit area. And I was working as chief manufacturing engineer for that program. So I got to go to Michigan and had set up a new division up there in the Detroit area. We chose to live in Rochester, Michigan, which was about 25 miles north. But anyway, I spent 6 years up there, and finally was able to get on a program that brought me back to Tyler, Texas, where we started a new division and built a little all-terrain type vehicle that they were hoping to sell to Southeast China for wet rice farming. Well, the people they had selling didn't know much about what they were doing, so after a couple of years we closed that thing up, and a couple of us got to come back to the Jefferson Street plant. And anyway, I stayed on with Vought then until 1985, and somewhere along in the late 60s, Vought kind of lost their in with the Navy because they had built Navy fighters for years and years and years. They built the F-4U Corsair and the A-7, the F-8. They built some really nice advanced technology airplanes. But by the 80s, they had kind of lost their relationship with the Navy, and they became nothing but a subcontractor to Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and all that sort of thing. And by that time, I had become involved with trying to provide computer-based systems to the whole company. And the concepts that I was working with really needed the whole full company product operations, from concept to engineering to testing and all that. So after 34 years with Vought, quote, LTV, I resigned, or I didn't resign, I retired, and I went to Sunnyvale, California to work for Lockheed Missiles and Space. That's where the Hubble telescope was built. And when I went there, I chose to live up at Fremont, Michigan, and drive down to Sunnyvale to work every day, and that got to be kind of adventurous. But anyway, after 4 years in Sunnyvale, I was working for a vice president who went down to the airplane company in Burbank, and he called back and asked me if I wouldn't like to come down to Burbank and work. So I transferred to Burbank from Sunnyvale, and we were in Burbank for a little over a year, and Lockheed decided to merge the Burbank operations with the Marietta, Georgia operations. So I moved, and I became eligible for a retirement package as a result of that consolidation. But the thing he had to do was to give them your last 9 months down at Marietta to help transfer the technology you were working with. So I spent my last 9 months in industry down at Marietta, Georgia. I had kept my house in Arlington, Texas. My youngest daughter was living there, so when I retired, I had a place to come back to. And I was not very happy about being retired because I didn't have anything to do. So I remodeled the whole house and redid the yard, built a carport, did all those kind of things. And then through my son-in-law, I found a little startup company over in Dallas. And these guys were taking old packaging machinery and rebuilding it to like new and tailoring it for a new product. So I went over and, excuse me, went over and did design work for them for about 8 years. And by that time, my wife had gotten pretty ill, and we moved from Arlington to Burleson, Texas, and I had to, well, during, and so the last project that I really got involved with was rebuilding an old chance bought airplane through our retirees club. We a group of guys decided it would really be neat if we could get old Vought airplanes and restore them and put them around in museums where younger generations could learn and understand the role of Vought aircraft in aviation. And they're not very widely known, but we thought that would be a good effort. So I got involved with the old airplane restoration. And in doing that, I was asked if I might be able to find a way to bring an old 1942 built aircraft from the Smithsonian in Dallas down to in Washington, D.C., down to Dallas. And so I came up with a concept to do it, and I built models of the airplane, and the old airplane was called the Flying Pancake. It was one of a kind, built in 1942, and its concept never matured because it was going to be a twin-engine fighter, but by 1945 or 6, fighters were all going to jets, so there were never going to be any more propeller-driven fighters after that. So the full contract did not mature, but we had this one old relic airplane that had been built, had been flying around, it had been in storage in the Smithsonian since about 1961. It was a wood frame fabric airplane, and it was the fabric was all rotting off of it, and the Smithsonian hadn't had time to get their people on it to restore it. So I came up with the concept of bringing it down to Dallas. And so I built a model of that concept and model of the airplane, and we took photos of it and sent them up to the Smithsonian. And they were interested enough that they asked me to come up for a meeting with them, and I went up and we had a meeting up there, and shortly after that they said, okay, you can have it. So I took a crew of guys up, and we brought the old Pancake back down to Dallas and started the restoration. And I ran the program for the first couple of years after we got it here, and then my wife had gotten very seriously ill, and she was needing me as a full-time caregiver. So I left the Pancake program to help take care of her, and she became a full-time endeavor for me. And the guys finally finished the restoration of the Pancake in April of 12, and we moved it over to the Frontiers of Flight Museum at Love Field in Dallas, where it still remains on display over there. And that's about the end of my adventures, except that after Mama Joan died, I found myself alone in an empty house, and that shouldn't happen to anybody. So I joined the volunteer auxiliary at Hughley Hospital on the south edge of Dallas. And I've been with those folks up there. There's about 160 of us. They're absolutely the nicest group of people you would ever want to be with. I've got a lot of friends. And we're all there for the same purpose. We're trying to help other people. And I get to work in the main lobby, and we do assist a lot of people in finding where they need to go, and getting them transported there in wheelchairs and helping them out in that regard. And like I say, the volunteers are a great group of people to work with because we're all there for the same purpose. We all get the same pay. And no volunteer bosses another volunteer, so it makes for a great, great environment, you know. And that's how I'm currently involved, and I hope to stay involved with them as long as I'm able. And I don't know how long that'll be because I'll be 90 years old in October, and I'm looking forward to making that milestone. That's about as far as I can go in one set of discussion items.
Very good, sir. You're well prepared.
Thank you.
Couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Neal. Did you have brothers, sisters?
I had a sister and a brother. Well, I had another little brother who died when he was 18 months old. He had a spinal problem or something. And he was about 3 years younger than me. But my sister developed a bad heart problem. She had a valve that was bad, and they did an operation. Well, she had one of the first open heart surgeries done. They were living here in Dallas, and she had to go to Indianapolis to get surgery because they weren't doing that here in this part of the country at that time. But anyway, they went in and scraped the valve. That didn't solve the problem. And later they went in and put in an artificial valve. And back in those days, which was like about 1953, somewhere along in there, an artificial valve was a little metal ring with a bird cage on it and a steel ball in it. And every time her heart would beat, you could hear it click, click, click. Wow. But anyway, it was not too many years after that. Well, she lived until 1966, and she died at the age of 41. I had a younger brother who was 7 to 8 years younger than I am, and he went into the military and was involved in the Korean thing. He was stationed in one of the little islands up in the Aleutians. And but being that much younger than me, and I left home when I was 19, so he was like a little runt kid, you know. But anyway, we were never really, really close, and we didn't grow up where we could do things together that much. But here a few years back, he had to have a spinal operation, and as a result of that, created more problems, and he has been bedridden for about the last 3 or 4 years. And the latest word I have from him is that he's not expected to live for another month. So, and he still lives up in Indiana.
I wondered about the military service, and you said he did serve in the Korean.
Yeah, he was in the Army in the Korean conflict, stationed in Shimya, on Shimya Island in the Aleutians.
If we go to your high school, you graduated the upper 10%.
Yes.
Did you consider college? Was that a consideration when?
My endeavor to get to college was through General Motors Tech.
Okay.
Because you come out of Tech with a full-fledged degree. Yeah.
Okay.
And that was my endeavor. But when I came back to Delco Remy, started work, I think, like the first day of 1947, second day of 1947. I said, okay, I'm ready for Tech. So they started the paperwork through. I was too old. They would not let me, they would not let a 23-year-old into that program. You had to be right out of high school in order to qualify for that program. In the meantime, I got married to Mama Joan, and I was too proud to let Mama Joan go to work and try to put me through college. So I had to do it the hard way.
You, when you went to work for Delco, you had 2 career paths. You could work in the shop at $2.69 an hour.
Yeah.
In 1942, 43?
43, yeah.
That was big time money, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
$2.69?
Yeah. But compare that to $115 a month. Yeah, that was big
With
money.
the career opportunity that
But
went
the
with
career
115.
opportunity was what I wanted.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an interesting decision for a young man who's
Well,
19, 20 years old.
You know, I always had a high regard for people who achieved a higher education, got their degree, became a doctor or whatever, you know, and I always wanted to do that, but I would not let my wife be the one that was responsible for getting me through it, you know.
Wow. You go through training and your CTD. I had a question here, rank, but then later you said you made lieutenant after. So when you went into this college program, you were still a private?
Yes.
What did private make those dollar-wise?
$50 a month.
$50 a month,
Yeah.
and room and board.
And room and board. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You bet, sir.
But of course, you could buy cigarettes a nickel a pack, you know.
And gasoline was, well, you couldn't get gasoline
Right.
during the war.
Yep.
And you probably did you
I
have a
didn't
car?
didn't have a car.
Okay. When you actually got operational and you got with the 366,
There was one step that I forgot to tell you about in there. After the college training detachment, I went to Maxwell Field, Montgomery, Alabama, which is cadet school.
okay,
And that was like 9 weeks going through cadet training at Maxwell Field. And you learn the principles of being an officer and the responsibilities and all that sort of thing when you go through the pre-flight training. And when we got out of Maxwell Field, then we were an aviation cadet.
okay. And you got the gold bar after you got out of advanced single engine,
Yes.
after you got out of the T6.
Yes.
Okay. When you got to Europe and you got with the 366, you got your P-47, did you fly the same airplane all the time?
No.
Or did
No.
the operations guy said you're in?
There were a few of the older guys who had an airplane assigned to them, but every one of those guys had to let other people fly it.
Okay.
So there were a lot more pilots than there were airplanes.
Before we started the interview, we were talking a little off the cuff. You talked about experience where you had 8 P-47s and you were jumped by a group of Luftwaffe.
Yes.
Like to relate that for our interview?
The mission was a volunteer mission, and they wanted volunteers, and I volunteered for the mission, and at that time we didn't know what the mission was going to be. And so I got picked. There were 8 of us that were picked to go on this volunteer mission, and we were just getting ready to jump off across, we were getting ready to cross the Rhine River in Germany. And when we went to the briefing for this mission, we found that it was going to be just a simple thing to go over and drop paper leaflets to the German people that were on the other side of the Rhine, telling the citizens to get out, that we were coming in. And it was kind of a thing to try to avoid killing as many people as you might. If the civilian population was all there and you're dive bombing and shooting rockets and blowing things up, it was to help preserve human life. And anyway, there were 8 of us chosen. The cities that we were going to address were Mönchengladbach and Krefeld. They were east of the Rhine River, but not too far. And so our 2 flights, a flight of 4 was assigned to go over Krefeld. That was the flight that I was on. The other flight went over Mönchengladbach. Excuse me, got a bad frog. But anyway, And going out on our mission that day, there was like a 3,000-foot solid overcast of clouds. So we stayed under the overcast when we were going out to our target destinations. And you had to be pretty low when you cut these paper bomblets loose, so you wouldn't scatter paper all over Germany. You put it where you wanted it. And so you had to be down below 1,000 feet when you cut them loose. And I was flying an old model P-47, one of the old Razorback jobs. It didn't even have the bubble canopy on it. And as such, I had 100 gallon less gasoline than the other guys on the flight, which should not have been a problem had we just gone out and come back. But and I didn't have any radio reception at all. My radio receiver was out. I could broadcast, but I couldn't receive. And I was assigned as wingman to the flight leader. There was a flight leader and a wingman, and then an element leader and his wingman. So there were 4 airplanes to each flight. And I was flying wingman to our flight leader, his guy named Bob Trombetta from California. And when we went down to make our drop, just after we dropped our bombs, I looked up and there were shell casings coming out of his airplane. So he was shooting at something. I look up and there's a FW-190 up there that he's shooting at. So the Germans had vectored somewhere around 20 airplanes in on us, and they had come in above the cloud layer, and we hadn't seen them at all. Didn't know they were there until they came down through the clouds and started after us. So the dogfight went on for about an hour, and both of our flights and the Germans were all mixed up in a melee of airplanes in that general area. And my flight leader played it really cool. We got kind of outside of that melee and picked a target and came in after that target. And we got 3 or 4 of them that day. And if you got it, that was good, but you went right on through the melee to the other side and then pick another target and come back through. And so, like I said, it went on for about an hour, and I was checking my gas, and I said, hey, Bob, if I'm going to get back, I got to start. So we got right up under the clouds and headed back for our air base. And anyway, when we got back to the base, I was virtually dry of gasoline. And so I didn't even come in and break away like we normally do. I just made a straight-in approach to the landing strip. And when I got it flared out in the landing position, my engine quit. Just before I touched down on the strip. So I was that close to being out of gas on that particular mission. But the bad thing about it was that 5 of the guys on that mission got shot down that day, and only 3 of us got back. And Bob Trombetta and I were the only pair that managed to stay as a pair during the whole event. And that's one thing that had been pounded into you for all of your training, all of your flight training. You never separate from a pair. You maintain a 2-man approach. Otherwise, if you get separated, you're virtually gone at that instant, you know. So we proved that point very, very clearly. But that was a tough mission. It was a tough mission.
Did you get credit anywhere for did you personally get credit for shooting down any?
No.
Did you have any other instances?
I've got credit for something like 11 airplanes on the ground, because that was our work. Mm-hmm. We were there to support our ground forces. Well, a big part of that support was blowing up trains, blowing up ammunition dumps, and attacking other German airports to get rid of their air force as much as we could. So I had credit for 11 airplanes on the ground that I'd blown up. And we always had film. We had cameras with our guns. We had 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 under each wing. We had 4 high velocity aircraft rockets, which were the big 4-inch rockets. And we could carry up to 2 1,000-pound bombs and a belly tank. The old P-47 was a real workhorse. And so most of the work that we did was, like I say, blowing up trains, ammunition dumps, and German airfields. And then we supported the troops a lot, going after tanks, armored vehicles, and that sort of thing. So that was primarily the work that we had to do.
If we go back to your dogfight, when it was time, when you looked at that gas gauge and it was time to get out of here, you and the boss went up so that you were just within the clouds?
Just under the clouds.
Just under, okay.
Yeah, just under the cloud
I guess
layer.
my question, you guys were all visual flight rules back then, right?
Well, no, no, we had instrument rules, and we had a lot of times where we flew through the clouds, and you just pull.
That's really my question.
You just pull in tight formation where you could see the man that you were with, and the flight leader flew instruments to where we were going, and the other three guys just tucked in right on him, in close formation.
You put all your faith in him and knowing he knew where you were going. It's kind of like following the guy down the interstate at 70 miles an hour in the fog.
Yep.
Just so you can see the taillights, everything's fine.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Let me ask you one last thing here, Mr. Neal. This, I think it's a V-173, is actually the flying pancake.
Yeah, that's this one. Yeah.
You brought that airplane back to Dallas and rebuilt the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
New fabric, new dope.
Yep. Yep.
Would it fly today?
It could, but it still belongs to the Smithsonian.
Okay.
It's now assigned to the Frontiers of Flight Museum over at Love Field, but none of the Smithsonian airplanes are permitted to fly.
Okay.
Their purpose is not to make flying airplanes. Their purpose is to make airplanes that can be put on display in museums throughout the country. So they do not permit any of their airplanes to be flown.
Okay. Well, we thank you for sharing your story, sir.
Well, it's been my great pleasure.
Thank you for the time in service, and thank you for coming to visit this morning.
Well,
You're well prepared. I think we had a great interview.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to talk about it, and that's one of the things I guess that I'm known for, is being outgoing.
Your work at Hughley, I see certainly as a double-edged sword. Number one, you do that service to the community, but secondly, it's also really good for Raymond Neal to have that too. You bet.
I get a lot of comfort in having the friends that I have up there. I'm not oriented with the church or any other organizations that would cause me to have associations other than that, And I thought about maybe getting more work by going out to other organizations that need volunteers, like Meals on Wheels, and I got invited to come down to the Trinity Mission here in Burleson to help those people. And I just lost my wife, and I went down there and looked the place over, and the people were all just slumped over in wheelchairs. And I looked around down there and I said that I don't think this is the right environment for me. It would be too depressing for me to try to do that. And I strongly felt that the work they were wanting done would be better done by family or church members or friends or that sort of thing. So I kind of declined other work. So my total volunteer focus is on what I'm doing at Hughley.
Very good, sir. Thank you very much.
It's been my great pleasure.